The story begins the desert always had a way of pressing in on a man. Out there, with the sun hanging low and swollen over the horizon, the world turned the color of old copper pennies. The mesquite and cactus cut dark against the light, stretching out into shadows that seemed too long, too sharp, like claws scratching over the land. A cowboy rode slow through that stillness, his horse's hooves thudding in rhythm, kicking up small puffs of red dust that trailed behind like smoke. His name didn't matter much on the trail. Names wore thin after enough years under the sky. Folks called him the cowboy, or rider, or just stranger if they didn't have time to learn more. All that stuck about him was the way he carried himself. Tall in the saddle, eyes narrowed against glare, a hat brim shading lines cut deep by sun and wind. His shirt was sweat dark at the collar, and the revolver at his hip rode easy, not as a threat, but as a habit. Out here, a man's iron was as much a tool as his lariat or his saddle knife. The evening was drawing down, that quiet stretch between daylight and the cool mercy of night. He figured on making camp near a dry wash, maybe boil coffee, chew jerky, and let his horse breathe. The land was hard, but it spoke plain. If you paid attention, the rustle of brush, the shift of wind, the scrape of stone, you could tell where water might be, where shelter waited, or where trouble stirred. That's when he saw a dot first, just a smear against the sky, smoke rising thin and straight. Not camp smoke, either too black, too heavy. A cook fire whispered up gray plumes, lazy as a feather in air. This was different, sharp-edged, like tar burning. His eyes narrowed. A man on the desert didn't ignore such a thing. He reined his horse to a stop, leather creaking under the paws. The animal snorted, ears flicking as though it sensed his tension. He tilted his head, listening. For a moment, the desert gave him nothing but its usual silence, broken only by cicadas whining and the scrape of grit shifting in the wind. Then, so faint he almost doubted it, came the sound of a cry. High-pitched, carried thin over distance. Not the voice of a grown man, but something smaller, children. He felt a prickle along the back of his neck. Out here, far from town and law, there weren't many good reasons for children to be wailing. The sound set his jaw tight. He spat dust from his mouth and gave the reins a flick. His horse started forward again, this time quicker, hooves drumming harder against the hardpan. The trail turned rocky, climbing over low rises and cutting through gullies. The smoke grew thicker the nearer he drew, twisting in the sky like a dark finger pointing him in. His gut warned him of danger, but the cry he'd heard had planted itself in him, and no decent man would turn away from such a sound. As he rode, the light shifted, the sun dipped lower, staining the clouds blood red. Shadows ran long across the land, and everything looked sharper, hungrier. He felt the weight of the desert pressing, the kind of silence that makes a man's heart beat louder in his own ears. He eased his revolver loose in its holster, not drawing it yet, but making sure it would come easy if he needed it. Out here, hesitation could kill faster than a bullet. The smoke smell reached him before the sight of its source did. Bitter, oily, clinging to the air. His horse balked once, then pressed on under his steady hand. Cresting a ridge, he finally caught sight of the valley below. A scattering of wagons and brush burned low. A camp blackened and broken. Shapes moved near the fire, rough men with rifles slung lazy, their laughter carrying faint but ugly across the space. And near them, tied with rope, two small figures sat huddled, their cries muffled now into soft whimpers. The cowboy pulled up, still as stone. His eyes hardened under the brim of his hat. Smoke still curled skyward, but it was the sound, the pitiful, frightened sound, that fixed his decision. He was bone-tired, hungry, and alone, but none of that mattered any more. Trouble had a way of finding him, and this time it had taken the form of two children in the hands of men who had no right to them. He drew a long breath, letting it out slow. The trail he'd been on ended here, replaced by something else. The desert had spoken, and he knew he couldn't ride past. Not tonight. The valley below was no camp of travelers. It was a snare, mean and ugly, thrown together by men who'd long since traded decency for easy gain. 5 of them lounged near the fire, their rifles stacked close, their talk sharp with liquor and cruelty. Behind them, 2 small figures sat roped and hunched Apache girls, no older than 10, their dark eyes wide with terror. The cowboy didn't need more than a glance to know what had happened. These weren't soldiers, and they sure weren't traitors. They were drifters, cutthroats who lived off pain. He'd seen their kind before, men who circled the edges of the frontier, snapping up whatever the law couldn't guard. Tonight, it was children. He eased his horse back behind the ridge, sliding from the saddle. The desert stretched quiet around him, holding its breath. He crouched low, hat pulled down, and studied the camp. Firelight licked across faces cracked with dirt, one man missing teeth, another with a scar carved deep across his cheek. They were armed, sloppy but dangerous. A frontal ride-in would get him and the girls killed Dot, so he worked the land. Moving slow as shadow, he slipped down the ridge, boots finding the silent spots between rock and sand. He circled wide, keeping to the scrub and mesquite until he was downwind of the fire. Close now, he could hear them clearer. "Fetch a fine price south of the border," one rasped. "Or trade him to the miners," another said with a snort. Men'll pay heavy for something this wild. The cowboy's jaw tightened. He thumbed the hammer of his Colt back just enough to hear the click. The girls whimpered, drawing a curse and a backhand from one of the captors. The sight of that hand striking small faces sealed it. Waiting longer was no option. The cowboy struck fast. He rose from the brush like a wraith, revolver barking once, twice. The first shot cracked the teeth smiler dead center, dropping him into the firelight. The second tore the scarred man's shoulder wide, sending him spinning. Chaos erupted. Who the hell? The camp jolted alive. One bandit scrambled for his rifle, only to find a bullet driving him flat before he got hold of it. The cowboy ducked low, rolling behind a fallen log as firelight strobed with muzzle flashes. Lead-chewed splinters where his head had been seconds earlier. He fired back, steady, measured. One shot at a time, each placed true. Another outlaw pitched backward, blood spraying against the wagon side. The last 2 broke one screaming, charging into the dark, the other fumbling to reload. The cowboy was faster. His Colt roared again, and the fumbling man collapsed with a grunt, rifle slipping useless from his grip. Silence fell sharp and sudden, broken only by the hiss of the fire and the panicked breathing of the 2 girls. Smoke hung heavy, gunpowder thick in the cowboy's nose. He stayed crouched a moment, eyes sweeping for movement. Nothing stirred but sparks lifting into the night. Finally, he rose. The girls shrank back at first, fear still raw. He holstered his gun slow, palms open to show peace. His voice came quiet, low enough to soften the edges of fear. "You're safe now. Nobody's gonna hurt you." They didn't answer, but their eyes wide, wet with tears fixed on him. He pulled his knife, cut the ropes binding their wrists, and helped them to shaky feet. One clutched his coat sleeve like a lifeline, the other pressed close to her sister. He led them away from the fire, past the sprawled bodies, back toward the safety of the ridge. Behind them, the camp lay broken, dead men cooling in the dust. The cowboy didn't look back. He knew the night wasn't done, not with gunfire echoing across canyons and blood fresh on the dirt. The rest of that pack, if any lived nearby, would come sniffing, and he had 2 little souls to keep alive before they did. The desert at night was no friend. Once the sun bled out behind the ridges, the world turned cold and sharp, every shadow holding the promise of danger. The cowboy led the 2 girls along the ridge, his hand steady on the reins of his horse, the other guiding them forward. Their small feet stumbled in the sand, their breath short with fear. They had only gone a mile before the sound hit him, a whistle, sharp and carrying on the wind. Not the sound of night birds. A signal. The cowboy cursed under his breath. He'd cut down most of the outlaws, but he hadn't accounted for every last one. Survivors had slipped off into the dark, and now they were calling others. He quickened the pace, half dragging the girls through brush and stone. Behind them came the faint drum of hooves light, but closing. "Keep low," he whispered, pulling the girls down into a dry wash. He pushed them flat against the earth, then crouched above, peering over the lip. Moonlight silvered the desert floor. Dust clouds moved along the trail, 3 riders sweeping wide, rifles slung across their backs. The cowboy's mind ran quick. 3 mounted men against him on foot with 2 children to protect. That was suicide. He needed ground, cover, and he needed it fast. He spotted it, a dark cleft in the rocks, half hidden by mesquite. A cave, shallow but deep enough to buy time. "Come on," he hissed. They scrambled through gravel, the girls' small hands clutching at him, their eyes wide with silent terror. The riders behind shouted now, their voices echoing across the flats. The cowboy shoved the girls inside the cave and crouched at the entrance, revolver in one hand, rifle slung from his shoulder. He slowed his breathing, let the night steady him. The riders came closer, hoofs pounding, laughter cutting sharp against the silence. "Think he went north?" One hollered. "No, there's tracks here." Another barked out. The cowboy waited until they were near, then raised the rifle and fired. The first rider screamed as the shot cracked his shoulder, sending him tumbling from the saddle. The horse reared, bolting into the night. The other 2 wheeled hard, shouting, rifles snapping up. Bullets sparked off stone near the cave mouth. The cowboy ducked back, chambered another round, and fired again, this one catching a rider in the leg, spinning him sideways. The last outlaw charged straight in, gun blazing. Stone chips flew, the air hot with lead. The cowboy fired once, missed, fired again, and this time the man's hat flew as the bullet tore past his head. The horse reared, screaming, and the rider toppled into the dirt. The cowboy didn't hesitate. He bolted from cover, charging down on the fallen man before he could right himself. Boot met jaw with a crack, and the outlaw slumped. The cowboy dragged him aside, rifle trained on his chest until the man groaned and went still. Silence again, except for the ragged breaths of the girls. They peered from the cave mouth, eyes wide, clutching each other. The cowboy knelt, reloading, scanning the horizon. More could be coming. These men were sloppy, mean, but not stupid. They'd keep searching. He returned to the girls, kneeling so his eyes met theirs. "We can't stay here. Gotta move quick, Quiet. You understand?" The older one nodded, lips pressed tight, her small hand gripping her sister's. The younger's eyes still shone with tears, but she gave the tiniest nod, too. "Good," he said, voice steady. He holstered his Colt, slung the rifle back, and lifted the smallest girl onto his hip. With the other close at his side, he slipped back into the night. The desert stretched before them and listened unforgiving. But he knew one thing. The girls were alive, and so long as he drew breath, he meant to keep them that way. The desert at night could swallow a man whole. Under the moon, the land turned silver and black, the ridges stretching like the backs of sleeping beasts. Every sound carried farther than it should. The scrape of stone under a boot, the dry rasp of brush bending in the wind. And somewhere behind, carried thin but sharp, came the echoes of men calling to one another. The cowboy kept the girls close, moving them through gullies and washes, always against the wind to scatter their scent and tracks. His boots found a quiet ground. his eyes scanning for the pale gleam of bone-dry stone places where their trail might break. The girls were light, but they stumbled often, their little legs not built for such relentless travel. Each time one fell, he'd scoop her up without a word, pushing forward into the dark. The pursuit was no longer a guess. He could feel it. Outlaws don't leave blood debt unanswered, not when it's one man against their pack. Gunfire may have thinned their numbers, but vengeance and greed were iron spurs that drove men harder than hunger ever could. They reached a shallow canyon, narrow walls rising high and jagged. The cowboy led them into its shadows, pressing them against the rock. He crouched, listening. The desert spoke in whispers, the shuffle of lizards, the sigh of cooling stone, but underneath it came something heavier, hoofbeats. Distant, but there. He leaned close to the girls. Not a sound, he breathed. Not a word. They nodded, eyes huge in the dark. The smaller one clung to her sister, trembling. The cowboy laid his hand on her head, gentle despite the steel in his voice. Then he drew his revolver, thumbing the hammer back slow. The hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off canyon walls. Shadows slid along the rim above, the outlines of riders searching, rifles glinting in the moonlight. Voices carried down. Tracks come this way. He's got 'em with him, can't be far. The cowboy pressed the girls deeper into the rocks, his own back flat against the cold wall. He held still as stone, breath shallow, while the riders passed overhead. One paused, scanning the canyon floor, and for a moment the cowboy's hand twitched toward his gun. But the man moved on, spitting into the dust. Minutes stretched like hours. The riders' voices drifted farther, their hoofbeats fading into the night. But the cowboy didn't move. He waited, counted slow inside his head, the way he'd been taught by men who lived and died on patience. Only when the desert was silent again did he rise. "Come on," he whispered. They followed, their steps muffled in sand. The canyon bent and narrowed until finally it opened into a wide plain, moonlight spilling over it like milk. Crossing meant exposure, plain as day, but there was no choice. Behind them, the echoes of pursuit had begun again, closer now, angrier. The cowboy hoisted the youngest onto his hip, took the older's hand, and stepped out into the open. The plain stretched endless before them, no cover but scattered rocks and the low rise of hills far ahead. He set a steady pace, every muscle tight with the knowledge that they were shadows moving against the silvered land. Halfway across, the sound came again, hoofbeats, sharper now, pounding closer. A shout tore across the night, then another. They'd been seen. The cowboy didn't run. Running burned strength, and the girls had little left. Instead, he veered toward the rocks, the promise of cover. Bullets whined past, sharp cracks splitting the silence. Dust kicked up around their feet. The girls cried out, stumbling, but he dragged them onward, his jaw locked tight. They reached the rocks, diving low. He shoved the girls flat behind a boulder, turning back with revolver drawn. Muzzle flash lit the dark as he fired, each shot placed calm, deliberate. Riders shouted, scattering wide. He clipped one horse, sending it rearing. Another rider broke off, dragging his wounded companion back. The night swallowed the rest, their shouts trailing into the distance. For now, the cowboy sank back against the stone, chest heaving. The girls clung to him, their faces pressed against his coat. He wrapped an arm around them, scanning the horizon. The pursuit wasn't over, no. It had just begun. But he bought them another hour of breathing. And in the desert, sometimes an hour meant the difference between dying in the dust and seeing the dawn. By dawn, the desert softened. The sky bled pale orange over the horizon, shadows shrinking back into the rocks. The cowboy had walked all night, leading the girls through gullies and ridges, always away from the echoes of pursuit. His horse plodded behind, carrying nothing but supplies. The girls were too small to ride double and too tired to walk steady. So he'd carried them more than once, their heads drooping heavy against his chest. When the sun broke, heat followed fast, rising like a weight pressing down on the land. The cowboy found a narrow arroyo shaded by cliffs, a place where the stone gave back a little cool. He crouched low, checked the ground for snakes, then motioned the girls inside. "Rest here," he said, voice rough from the night. The older one quiet, watchful, helped her sister settle against the wall. The younger girl dropped to the sand without a word, exhaustion taking her. The cowboy dug into his saddlebag, pulled free his canteen, and passed it over. Small sips. "Don't waste." The older girl did as told, then handed it back without keeping more than a swallow for herself. Her dark eyes met his, cautious but steady. He nodded once, a soldier's nod, an understanding passing between them. He pulled jerky from his kit, tore it into smaller pieces, and gave it to them. The younger chewed slow, blinking up at him as if unsure whether to trust this stranger who had pulled her from fire and gun smoke. But she leaned against him all the same, the kind of trust born not from choice but from need. The cowboy sat watch, rifle across his knees, hat tipped low. Every so often his gaze flicked upward, scanning the ridges. He knew the men were still out there. Outlaws didn't quit easy, not with revenge and profit tangled together. But chasing was one thing. Tracking in the desert was another. He'd led them across stone, through washes, places where a man's sign scattered thin. That might buy time. The girls whispered together in Apache, voices too soft for him to catch. He didn't pry. Children needed their own tongue, their own comfort, especially when the world had turned so hard against them. Instead, he closed his eyes for a moment, letting the cool shade work its way into his bones. When the sun climbed higher, he roused them. "We move again." They obeyed without complaint, though the younger stumbled often, her feet dragging. The cowboy lifted her onto his hip once more, her arms curling around his neck. She was light as a sack of grain, but the weight still pressed on him. He bore it without a sound. By midday, they reached the edge of a dry riverbed. The cowboy crouched, pressing fingers into the dust. A trickle of dampness clung beneath the surface. Not enough for a river, but maybe enough to dig. He set the girls to rest under a crooked cottonwood, then went to work with his knife, scraping until a shallow pool seeped through. The girls crowded close, cupping water in their hands, splashing faces streaked with dirt. For a moment, laughter broke free, a sound sharp and sudden in the empty land. The cowboy watched, a faint tug at the corner of his mouth. He hadn't heard laughter in weeks, maybe months, but the moment couldn't last. A hawk circled overhead, its cry slicing through the heat. The cowboy's eyes shifted to the horizon, scanning the rippling air. Dust hung faint in the distance riders, maybe, or just wind. Hard to say. He packed them up again, pushing toward the mesas that marked Apache land. The journey slowed, every step heavy with heat, every breath tasting of dust. Still, they pressed on, the girls keeping pace beside him, one small hand always locked in his dot as the sun began its slow fall west. The cowboy spotted smoke on the horizon, not black and sharp like before, but pale and thin, rising straight into the sky. A signal, a village. The girls saw it too. Their faces lit, exhaustion forgotten. They broke into a run, tugging his hand, voices rising in quick, eager Apache words he couldn't understand but didn't need to. For the first time since the night began, the cowboy let himself breathe easier. Safe passage wasn't guaranteed, yet not with outlaws still hunting, but the land ahead promised more than dust and danger. It promised home. The smoke on the horizon grew clearer with every step, until the shapes of lodges came into view, low and round against the red earth. The girls broke into a run, their bare feet kicking up dust, their laughter ringing out. The cowboy followed slower, his long stride steady, his hand resting light on his rifle, though his gut told him it wasn't needed here. A shout went up from the village. Men and women spilled from the lodges, drawn by the sight of the two girls returning. Voices rose startled, disbelieving, then breaking into cries of joy. The girls flung themselves forward, straight into the arms of a woman who came running harder than the rest, her dark braids flying behind her. She dropped to her knees in the dust, gathering them both against her chest, weeping openly. The older girl clung tight. The younger buried her face in her mother's shoulder, sobbing with the kind of relief only a child could carry. The woman rocked them, murmuring words in Apache, her voice shaking with both sorrow and joy. The cowboy stopped at the edge of the village. He removed his hat, holding it low at his side. This wasn't his moment. He'd brought them home. Now they were no longer his to worry over. The sight of the mother clutching her daughters stirred something in him, something he couldn't name, but felt sharp, like a spur pressed against his ribs. Men of the village gathered, eyes cautious, weighing the stranger. He stood tall but unthreatening, his rifle slung, revolver holstered, his stance calm. He didn't meet their eyes long, didn't challenge, didn't bow too low. Just stood there, steady. The way a man did when he knew his place was temporary. The mother rose at last, her daughter still pressed to her. She looked toward him, her gaze fierce but not unkind. The girls spoke quickly in Apache, pointing at him, their hands waving, telling a story too big for their small voices. He couldn't understand their words, but the way they reached for him told enough. The mother crossed the dust toward him. The crowd watched, silent, the air thick with judgment and curiosity. She stopped a pace away, her daughters clutching at her skirts. For a moment, she only studied him, his dust-caked clothes, the lines of his face, the weariness etched in every crease. Finally, she spoke in halting English. "You bring them back." The cowboy nodded once. "Found 'em taken by outlaws." "Did what I could?" Her eyes softened, though tears still streaked her cheeks. "You risk much, alone." He shifted his weight, looking down at the girls who peeked at him from behind their mother. "Couldn't ride on and leave 'em. No man worth his saddle would." The mother bowed her head slightly, a gesture of respect. The girls darted forward then, breaking from her grasp to hug his legs. He froze a moment, awkward in the suddenness of it, then let a hand fall to their heads, resting there gently. The crowd's tension eased. Voices rose again, this time not with suspicion, but with murmurs of approval. A fire was stoked, and women carried food and water, setting it out. The cowboy was offered a place by the flames, but he shook his head. He'd done his part. This was family business now, not his. He stepped back, pulling his hat on. "They're safe," he said quietly. "That's all that matters." The mother watched him turn to leave, her brow furrowed as though some decision was stirring in her. But she didn't call after him, not yet. She only held her daughters close, their laughter filling the air, a sound that belonged here in the village, not on the lonely trail he was bound to return to. The cowboy moved toward his horse, the weight of dust and miles already settling back on his shoulders. He had no home but the horizon, no kin but the saddle beneath him. Still, something about the look in that mother's eyes made him pause, as though his trail wasn't quite finished here after all. The cowboy had already saddled his horse by the time she came. The sun had slipped low, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and gold. The village behind him buzzed with life drums thudding faint, voices rising in song. Celebration, he reckoned, for the daughter's safe return. He didn't belong in it. That much he knew. So he tightened the cinch, checked his rifle, and swung his hat back onto his head. He'd ride out before the moon climbed, slip into the desert quiet, the way he always did. But then he heard her steps. Soft, deliberate. The girl's mother stood a few paces away. Her daughters pressed against her skirts, still unwilling to let her go far. She regarded him in silence for a long while. The evening light touched her face, carving it in bronze and shadow. She carried something in her hand, wrapped in deerskin. "You go," she said at last, her English careful, each word placed like a stone. The cowboy touched the brim of his hat. "Trail's waiting," she nodded, then stepped closer. "Before you go, gift." He opened his mouth to protest. Gifts made him uneasy. He hadn't done what he did for reward. But she raised a hand, silencing him with a look firm as granite. Then she unwrapped the bundle. Inside lay a small carving, bone polished smooth, threaded with turquoise and bound in rawhide cord. The shape was abstract but powerful, part eagle, part coyote, part something older, a symbol that seemed to hum with meaning he couldn't name. "This," she said, lifting it with both hands, "is strong medicine. My people call it protector of paths. Bone from the desert, turquoise from the earth. Spirit lives in it. It see you safe." The cowboy stared, throat dry. He'd seen trinkets sold to travelers, tokens carved for coin. But this was different. The weight of it wasn't in its size, but in the way she held it, reverent, like it carried something deeper than stone or bone. He shook his head slightly. "Ma'am, I can't take." "You will," she said, firm, pressing it toward him. "My daughters breathe because of you. No gold, no horse, no words carry that weight. Only this." The girls tugged at his coat then, their small hands urging. Their eyes were bright, still rimmed with the shadows of fear, but alive, burning with the fierce gratitude of children. The younger one whispered something in Apache, and though he didn't understand, he caught its meaning in the way she pressed the carving into his palm. The cowboy closed his hand around it. The bone was warm from her touch, the turquoise cool against his skin. He swallowed hard, then nodded once. "Thank you." The mother's face softened. She spoke again, voice low. "This gift not for you alone. It carry you, yes. But it also remember. You walk with our spirit now. Not stranger. Not enemy. Man who brought back life." For a long moment, neither moved. The desert wind shifted, tugging at their clothes, whispering over the sand. Then the cowboy slipped the cord over his neck, letting the talisman settle against his chest. It felt strange there, but steady like it belonged. Though he couldn't say why, he touched the brim of his hat again, this time deeper. "Reckon I'll carry it with honor." The mother inclined her head, then drew her daughters back, folding them against her. She said nothing more, only watched as he swung into the saddle. The cowboy turned his horse toward the horizon. The sky had darkened to violet, the first stars pricking through. The bone and turquoise talisman rested against his chest. Heavy in a way no metal ever could be. As he rode, a calm settled over him. The desert no longer pressed so heavy. For the first time in many trails, he didn't feel entirely alone. Night swallowed the desert whole as he rode. The stars came out sharp and cold, scattered thick across the sky like a million watchful eyes. The cowboy sat tall in the saddle, the horse moving steady beneath him, hooves thudding a rhythm older than towns, older than fences. The talisman rested against his chest, its bone and turquoise catching the starlight when the wind shifted his coat. He touched it once, feeling the smoothness of its surface, the weight of it. He wasn't a man given to superstition. He trusted steel, horseflesh, and the grit in his own belly. But this gift, this thing carved from earth and bone, felt different. Not a trinket. Not chance. The wind carried sounds far across the flats. He caught the faint cry of coyotes, the whisper of brush, the low hum of life moving unseen. And beneath it all, or maybe only in his own head, he felt something steady. A presence. As if the land itself had shifted, marking him in some quiet way. He thought of the girls, their laughter breaking through the dust and fear. He thought of their mother, her eyes fierce with both grief and gratitude. He'd walked them back from the edge, but they had given him something too. A place in memory, a place in spirit. For a man who belonged nowhere, that was no small thing. The horizon stretched endless, as it always did. But for the first time, it didn't feel like it was pushing him away. It felt like it was calling him onward, like the trail ahead wasn't just dust and loneliness, but a line drawn toward something waiting. His horse snorted, ears flicking toward the north. The cowboy lifted his gaze. Out there, beyond ridges and mesas, he could just make out another faint glow against the sky. Not fire from outlaws, this glow was softer, steadier, like lamplight from a distant settlement. He could ride away, back into the nothing, as he always had. But the talisman pressed against his chest, warm from his skin, and he felt the pull of it. Maybe it was only the weight of a promise unspoken, but binding that he'd keep walking the edge between danger and mercy. Maybe it was more. He reined the horse northward. The trail bent, disappearing into the dark. Behind him, the village faded, swallowed by night. Ahead, the land waited wild, untamed, dangerous as ever. But the cowboy felt different. He rode not only with his own shadow, but with the weight of spirits, the laughter of children, and the silent strength of a mother's gift. The desert stretched wide and endless, but his heart no longer felt hollow inside it. Somewhere out there, trouble was waiting as it always did. But now, when it came, he wouldn't meet it alone. He tipped his hat against the starlight, touched the talisman once more, and let his horse carry him into the horizon. The cowboy rode on.